The Battle of the Western Front turned into a catastrophic defeat for the German army. At first glance, Germany had prepared thoroughly. It had turned the western coast into an impregnable fortress and, it seemed, was ready to repel any Allied invasion. But a series of fatal command miscalculations and Hitler's personal errors led to the war being lost here, costing the Reich up to 1 million soldiers. Let's look at the Western Front through the eyes of those who defended it, and find out why this colossal defense line collapsed. By the spring of 1944, German intelligence was in possession of vital information. The Wehrmacht High Command understood perfectly well that sooner or later the Allies would decide to land along the Atlantic coast. Two key questions remained: when and where. As long as the answer remained unknown, Germany wasted no time. A network of defensive structures, named their Atlantic Wall, was built along the entire coast. This massive project, which took several years to construct, was intended to turn the European coastline into an impenetrable fortress. However, there was one resource that could not be replenished: manpower. Even for such a monumental project, which required countless amounts of metal and concrete, colossal human resources were needed. And since the main, heaviest fighting was taking place far to the east, it was there that any trained and combat-ready soldiers were sent. The defense on the west was based on poorly trained and poorly organized German units, as well as collaborators from occupied territories, including the Soviet Union. Their command's idea was that these forces would be sufficient to push the enemy back into the sea, or at least hold them until the arrival of regular reserves located deeper inland. In the spring of '44, German intelligence received new, more precise information about a possible Allied landing that very year. Intelligence agents inside Britain and aerial photography confirmed the facts, and the increasing frequency of anti-air bombardment only strengthened the conviction: the landing was imminent. Taking into account all the gathered facts, the German command designated the location of the future Allied landing operation, the Pas-de-Calais area. It was decided to transfer the entire 15th Army and the best Luftwaffe units available in France there. 59 divisions defended the territory of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. However, so as not to weaken other potential strike zones, Hitler was forced to divide his troops and send some units to Army Group G in the south, for protection against the Mediterranean. Army Group B, under the command of Erwin Rommel, was left to defend northern France and Belgium. Soon, direct signals of the approaching Allied landing arrived. Starting May 30th, the bombardment of German positions near Calais intensified, and multiple practice sorties by the British and US fleets were observed. On June 6, 1944, Allied vessels began the landing. As Hitler had expected, Anglo-American forces attempted to take the beaches at the narrowest point of the English Channel. The prepared defenses repelled the attack. But it was too early to celebrate victory. Alarming reports began to flow into the Wehrmacht High Command headquarters. Allied forces had started a landing operation in another area, Normandy. Hours passed, and such reports grew more numerous. The next day, German generals grasped the full scale of the disaster. Allied forces, supported by the navy and air power, had seized the Normandy beaches and began pushing deep into French territory. And the landing the Germans had repelled in the Calais area was nothing more than a well-organized, serious Operation Bodyguard designed for deception. This clever move by the Allies literally threw the German command into disarray. In a situation where every hour favored the Anglo-American forces, the Germans were slow to act. Furthermore, it was only 10 days later that Hitler gave the order to redeploy the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from the Eastern Front. However, the newly arrived divisions were weakened, lacked the necessary fuel and ammunition supplies, and were disorganized by Allied air attacks. They could not turn the tide. June 7, 1944. Lieutenant K. We are standing and waiting for orders. It's hard to believe we were so completely deceived. Everything was ready in Calais, and they landed where we only had old men and teenagers. They, the Allies, are everywhere, and we can't move because of the Führer's order to hold reserves. Every day we lose vehicles to their air force. This isn't war, it's a hunt. Thanks to this delay, the Allies gained a massive advantage in forces and resources on the crucial first day of the invasion. The selflessness of individual Wehrmacht soldiers only delayed the advance, but could not stop it. Within weeks, during the conspiracy known as Operation Valkyrie, an assassination attempt was made on Hitler. The Wehrmacht High Command tried to remove the top leadership, but by chance and due to serious plotters' errors, the Führer survived. Starting in August, the situation for Germany on the Western Front only worsened. Following the success of Allied Operation Cobra, Alliance troops pushed deep into France, moving beyond Normandy. To prevent the Allies from capitalizing on this success, Adolf Hitler ordered Army Group Commander Gunther von Kluger to launch a counteroffensive. Due to an extreme lack of troops, he forbade allocating units from other sectors to the attack, thereby placing the advancing divisions at a numerical disadvantage. Nevertheless, following the Führer's orders, Operation Lüttich was developed. Hitler tasked the German forces with breaking through to the Atlantic coast and cutting off parts of the US Third Army. This plan proved overly optimistic and did not reflect the actual situation at the front. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS Panzer divisions only managed initial success and were soon halted. Allied aircraft inflicted heavy losses on the advancing troops, ultimately destroying about half of the tanks involved in the offensive. The German attack failed, but this failure led to an even greater catastrophe. Through Allied Operation Totalize, American and Polish forces closed the Falaise pocket. About 100,000 German soldiers were encircled. Only 20,000 managed to break out of their pocket. The rest perished or were captured. The once mighty 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, which numbered 20,000 men at the start of the Normandy campaign, lost 94% of its tanks, almost all its artillery, and 70% of its trucks, shrinking to just 300 men after escaping the pocket. Germany lost a significant amount of equipment, and these losses were irreplaceable. August 19, 1944. Soldier J. I got out. Got out of that hell where everything that moves was burning. We left our Tigers and Panthers stuck in the mud. They bombed them for hours. They say less than a regiment is left of our division. They say this is the end. We are running. Just running. While the German army was retreating through France, the Allies undertook a new landing operation, this time in the south of France. A large German reserve, consolidated into Army Group G under Blaskowitz, was ordered to defend the coast. However, the string of failures in the north threatened to encircle the entire Army Group G, and therefore the Führer decided to abandon southern France and withdraw the troops for the future defense of Germany. Soon Allied forces approached Paris. Distressed by the retreat, Hitler ordered his troops to hold the city at all costs, and in case of failure, to raze it to the ground. However, the swift approach of numerous American forces and an uprising in the city left no chance for Germany to hold it. The enraged Hitler ordered the French capital to be blown up, but the city commandant, von Choltitz, was more concerned with his own fate. He disobeyed the order, and so Paris, against Hitler's will, was spared. German troops were retreating across the entire Western Front, and by September, they had crossed into occupied Belgium. Still reeling from the Falaise pocket, the German forces could not halt the Allied advance. The logical decision was made, to retreat to their Siegfried Line and fight for Germany itself. However, to prevent the Allies from using the ports of the Netherlands, it was decided to keep that country under German control. This worked. The swift advance of Allied forces stretched their supply lines, ultimately bringing their offensive to a complete halt. This was a small victory for Germany, which, however, no longer mattered. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht came under a new Allied attack, this time in the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden began on September 17. According to one version, information about the impending operation was leaked to German intelligence by a Dutch agent, allowing Germany to prepare. Large German tank reserves, though numerically inferior to the attacking army, were able to resist the Allies and effectively thwart the entire operation. Market Garden became the biggest defeat for the Allies on the Western Front. By November 1944, the front stabilized. German forces, timely withdrawn from other sectors for the defense of Germany, had fulfilled their mission. Anglo-American forces were stopped at the borders of the Reich. However, Germany was no longer the same. In the east, Soviet forces had already reached the borders of East Prussia. Everywhere, Hitler was facing defeat. Starting in November, the Allies launched a major offensive across the entire front. Hitler, as 6 months earlier, once again ordered a new, much more massive offensive plan to be developed. The main focus of the attack, just like in 1940, was to be the Ardennes forest. The goal of the operation was nothing less than to cut off Belgium and the Netherlands, reach the sea, and thus persuade America to a separate peace. This was primarily intended to free up troops for the Eastern Front. For the operation's success, Hitler personally ordered the development and execution of the sabotage operation Greif. Soldiers proficient in English were recruited from all Wehrmacht units, and captured American tanks and vehicles were prepared. All of this was meant to sow chaos among American troops before the offensive. However, as Otto Skorzeny, who led the operation, admitted, no more than 10 men spoke English without an accent. The German offensive began on the morning of December 16. By December 25, the Germans had advanced 90 kilometers deep into the defense. Much of the operation's success was due to the German commando groups, who, dressed in U.S. Army uniforms and fluent in English, seamlessly blended into the retreating Anglo-American forces, creating confusion and disorganization. The German command heavily relied on its heavy armor and non-flying weather. Due to constant snowfalls and heavy cloud cover, Allied aircraft could not operate for several days, temporarily neutralizing the Allied air superiority. But by the end of December, the weather improved, and the Allies immediately took advantage. Allied aircraft began striking the advancing German forces and bombing supply lines. German troops, experiencing an acute shortage of fuel, as they failed to capture the fuel depots, ground to a halt. By the 22nd, the 6th Panzer Army ceased its advance. Meanwhile, American forces, reinforced by redeployment from other sectors, launched a counterattack. To dislodge the Germans, Allied forces even had to ask Stalin to launch an offensive in the east. Following an affirmative answer, the Vistula-Oder operation began 8 days earlier than planned. The Ardennes offensive, despite initial success, lost momentum. Hitler gave the order for a phased withdrawal. The Wehrmacht irrevocably lost strategic initiative. There was virtually nowhere for German forces to draw reinforcements to cover the losses sustained in Normandy and during the retreat from France. Luftwaffe personnel were transferred to the ground forces, and the practice of using the Volkssturm became widespread. Hitler desperately tried to save the country. By February 45, another terrible event added to the frontline defeats, the bombing of Dresden. Over a few days, Allied aircraft almost completely destroyed the city. In February and March, Germany continued its final retreat. The German command ordered sluice gates to be opened and dams on the Ruhr River to be blown up to delay the enemy's advance. This worked, but only briefly. On March 7, the American 9th Armored Division captured the railway bridge near the town of Remagen, crossing to the right bank of the Rhine. Within a single day, the Americans moved 5 divisions across the bridge. The situation was catastrophic. The lack of resources did not allow the German command to create any lasting defense on the Western Front. The Allied command decided to focus its main efforts on destroying the German grouping in the Ruhr area. This was preceded by powerful air preparation, which resulted in the destruction of vital bridges and communication hubs, severely complicating the communication of German forces defending the Ruhr industrial region with the rest of Germany. This move sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Within a week, Allied forces completely encircled Army Group B. The encircled troops were utterly demoralized and suffered from an acute lack of everything. Nevertheless, the German command decided to hold the Ruhr to tie down Anglo-American forces there and prevent their use on other sectors. This move can be called desperate but effective, as it forced the American army to focus on eliminating the encircled forces and temporarily forget about advancing east. More than 2 weeks passed before the encircled German soldiers lost combat effectiveness. By then, the surrounded troops were already split into 2 parts. The complete annihilation of all forces was only a matter of time. The commander of Army Group B, Walter Model, entered into negotiations with the Allied forces. On April 17, he ordered resistance to cease and shot himself. On April 18, German forces completely ceased resistance in the Ruhr. Around 317,000 German soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. The destruction of the last major German grouping in the Ruhr caused the entire German Western Front to collapse. Organized resistance ceased, resulting in Allied armies rapidly advancing eastward and operating freely in Germany, meeting only minor resistance in isolated areas. On April 25, Soviet and Allied forces divided Germany into two parts. That same day, the Red Army began the storming of Berlin. The Reich was living its last days. On April 30, it became known that Hitler had shot himself in his bunker. Resistance finally ceased only after the complete occupation of southern Germany and Austria. On the night of May 8 to 9, the German command signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender of all Nazi Germany. The reasons for Germany's defeat on the Western Front lay in the catastrophic error in determining the landing site on June 6, 1944. If Germany had managed to push the Allies back into the sea, the losses incurred would have forced them to abandon the idea of a northern France landing. Furthermore, the orders for the offensive from the Falaise Pocket and the Ardennes were too optimistic and only inflicted irreplaceable losses on the already limited Wehrmacht forces. Finally, the relentless advance of the Soviet army in the east drew away all the main forces of the Wehrmacht, ultimately destroying the German war machine. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like. Next time, we will look at the battles of World War II that involved more than 4 million soldiers. Write your guesses and topics in the comments below the video.